I held the engagement ring between my fingers under the fluorescent lights of the bank lobby, and I couldn't stop shaking. The ring wasn't mine anymore. It was evidence. The manager had just slid 3 pages across the marble counter, each one showing withdrawals I never authorized, transfers to accounts I'd never heard of, and a mortgage application on our house signed with my name in handwriting that wasn't quite right. My husband stood 15 feet behind me, near the revolving door, hands in his pockets, watching. He looked calm. He looked like a man waiting for his wife to finish her banking so they could grab lunch. But I wasn't finishing banking. I was discovering that the man I'd been married to for 32 years had been planning my financial erasure for at least 9 months. The same 9 months since I caught him kissing his dental hygienist in our driveway after a neighborhood barbecue. He called it a mistake. He said it meant nothing. He cried at our kitchen table and swore it would never happen again. I believed him. I forgave him. And now I was standing in front of a bank manager who was asking me very carefully if I needed to speak to someone from their fraud department or if I wanted to call the police. My coffee from this morning was still sitting in my car in the parking lot. I could see it through the glass doors. It was probably cold by now. My knee hurt from standing in heels I hadn't worn in 6 months. My reading glasses were somewhere in my purse, but I couldn't find them, so I held the papers close to my face like an old woman squinting at a menu. I was 63 years old. I had 3 grandchildren under the age of 7. My daughter controlled every Sunday dinner, every holiday visit, every casual drop-by to see the kids. And 2 weeks ago, she stopped answering my calls. If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Let me go back 6 months before that moment in the bank lobby, because none of this makes sense without understanding what I thought my life was. I thought I had a good marriage. Not perfect, but good. 32 years with the same man, raising 2 kids in the same house in a quiet suburb outside Richmond, a place where people knew your name at the hardware store and you ran into your neighbors at the grocery store on Saturday mornings. My husband worked in sales for a medical supply company. I taught elementary school for 29 years before I retired. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We owned our house outright. We had savings. We had a modest retirement account and a small investment property, a duplex we bought 15 years ago that brought in enough rental income to cover property taxes and give us a little breathing room. My daughter married a man who worked in finance, and they lived 20 minutes away with my 3 grandchildren. My son lived in California with his wife, and we saw them twice a year. I had my routines. I had my book club on Thursday nights. I volunteered at the church food pantry on Tuesdays. I babysat the grandkids every other weekend. I thought I knew what the rest of my life looked like. Small and predictable and safe. I remember the night I found the kiss because it wasn't dramatic. It was July. Still light outside at 8:30 in the evening, and we'd hosted a barbecue for the neighborhood association. About 20 people. My husband grilled burgers and hot dogs. I made potato salad and set up folding chairs in the backyard. People stayed late because it was a Friday and nobody had anywhere to be. Around 9 o'clock, I went inside to refill the ice bucket, and when I came back out, I saw my husband standing in the driveway next to his car, leaning close to a woman I recognized as someone from his dentist's office. I'd met her twice, once when I went with him for a cleaning, and once at the office holiday party 2 years ago. Her name was Amy or Amber or something that started with an A. She was laughing. He was laughing. And then he kissed her. It wasn't long, maybe 3 seconds, just a press of lips, nothing wild or desperate, but it was a kiss. And then she got into her car and drove away, and he walked back toward the house, and he saw me standing there holding the ice bucket. He froze. His face went white, and I didn't yell. I didn't throw the ice at him. I just walked back inside, put the bucket down on the kitchen counter, and went upstairs to our bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed and I waited. I heard him saying goodnight to the last guests. I heard him locking the back door and turning off the porch light. I heard his footsteps on the stairs. And when he came into the bedroom, I said, "Was that the first time?" He closed the door. He sat down next to me. He cried. He said it was a mistake. He said it was nothing. He said he'd had too much to drink, and she'd been flirting with him all night, and it was stupid, and he was sorry, and it would never happen again. He begged me not to leave him. He said he loved me. He said he couldn't lose me, and I believed him, because 32 years is a long time, because we had grandchildren who needed stability, because my daughter was already texting me, asking if everything was okay, because she'd seen people leaving early and wondered if something was wrong, because I was 63 years old and I didn't know how to start over. So I forgave him. But forgiveness costs something. I didn't trust him the same way anymore. I checked his phone when he was in the shower. I looked at the mileage on his car. I asked too many questions about where he'd been and who he'd seen. He got irritated. He said I was being paranoid. He said he'd apologized, and he didn't know what else I wanted from him. By September, we barely spoke unless we had to. By October, he started staying late at work 3 or 4 nights a week. He said his company was launching a new product line, and he had extra meetings. He said it was temporary. He came home tired and distant and ate dinner in front of the television. I spent more time with my daughter and the grandkids. I took them to the park. I helped with homework. I made cookies with my oldest granddaughter and taught her how to fold the dough just right. Those Saturday afternoons were the only time I felt like myself, but even that started to change. My daughter began making excuses for why I couldn't come over. She said the kids were busy with activities. She said they had birthday parties and play dates and school events. She said she'd call me when things calmed down. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself she was overwhelmed. Single parenting is hard even with a spouse, and her husband traveled a lot for work. But the space between her calls got longer. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. I left voicemails. I sent texts asking if I could bring dinner or pick up groceries or just stop by for 20 minutes to see the kids. She responded with short, polite messages. "Thanks, Mom. We're good. Talk soon." And I started to wonder if my husband had told her something, if he'd said I was acting crazy or controlling or paranoid, if he'd painted me as the problem. By November, I hadn't seen my grandchildren in 6 weeks. My daughter finally agreed to let me come over for Thanksgiving dinner, but when I arrived, the house felt cold, polite but cold. My son-in-law answered the door and gave me a quick hug that felt like a handshake. My daughter smiled but didn't quite meet my eyes. The kids ran up and hugged me, and I held on to them a little too long, breathing in the smell of their shampoo and the grass stains on their knees. We ate turkey and mashed potatoes and pumpkin pie, and everyone made small talk about school and work and the weather, and nobody asked me how I was doing. Nobody asked about my husband, who'd stayed home claiming he had a migraine. When I left that night, I sat in my car in their driveway for 10 minutes before I started the engine. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, watching the light in their living room window, feeling like I'd lost something I couldn't name. The closing date on the duplex refinance was set for December 15th. I didn't know that yet. I didn't know my husband had already contacted a mortgage broker. I didn't know he'd forged documents with my name. I didn't know he'd been planning to pull equity out of the rental property and transfer the money into an account I didn't have access to. But I was about to find out, because 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I got a call from our property management company asking why we were selling. I told them we weren't. The woman on the phone paused. She said she'd received an email from my husband saying we were refinancing and might be selling by spring, and he wanted to know if she could recommend a real estate agent. I hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen with my hand still on the receiver, and I felt my pulse in my throat. I walked into the home office where my husband kept his desk, and I opened the filing cabinet. I pulled out the folder labeled rental property. Inside were the original deed, the old mortgage papers from when we paid off the loan 5 years ago, tax returns, and a stack of recent bank statements I'd never seen before. Statements from an account that showed monthly deposits from the rental income, deposits that had been going into an account with only his name on it, not our joint account, not the account we used for household bills, a separate account, for 2 years. I sat down on the floor. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the papers. I thought about the kiss in the driveway. I thought about his late nights at work. I thought about my daughter's cold politeness and my son-in-law's careful distance. I thought about my grandchildren asking why I didn't visit anymore, and I realized I'd been set up. I didn't know the details yet. I didn't know how deep it went, but I knew my husband had been moving pieces on a board I didn't even know existed, and I knew I was running out of time. What was he planning to do with that money? And why did my daughter stop letting me see the grandkids right when this all started? The next morning, I made an appointment at the bank. I told my husband I was going to the grocery store. I drove to the branch where we'd had our accounts for 23 years, and I asked to speak to a manager. I brought the bank statements I'd found in the filing cabinet. I brought our joint account information. I brought my ID and my social security card and the deed to our house. The manager was a woman in her 40s named Karen or Catherine, someone I'd seen behind the desk a dozen times but never really talked to. She invited me into a small glass office near the back of the lobby. I sat down in a chair that was too low and made my knees ache. I slid the papers across her desk and I said, "I need to know what accounts my husband has opened without telling me." She looked at the papers. She looked at me. She asked if I had concerns about financial abuse. I said I didn't know yet. I said I just needed to see the full picture. She typed on her computer for what felt like a long time. She frowned. She printed 3 pages and handed them to me. That's when I saw the withdrawals. That's when I saw the transfers. That's when I saw the mortgage application on our house, not the rental property, submitted 6 weeks ago with my forged signature. The application claimed we needed funds for medical expenses. It listed our income. It listed our assets. It requested a home equity line of credit for $90,000. The approval was pending final signatures at a closing scheduled for December 15th, 8 days away. I felt dizzy. I gripped the edge of the desk. The manager asked if I was okay. I said I needed a minute. She left the office and came back with a small paper cup of water. I drank it in one swallow. I asked her what I could do. She said if the signature was forged, I could file a fraud report with the bank and with the police. She said I could freeze my credit. She said I should consult a lawyer immediately. She printed copies of everything and put them in a manila envelope. She wrote down the name of an attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse. Elder. I was 63. I didn't feel like an elder. I felt like someone who'd been sleepwalking through her own life while someone else picked her pockets. I walked out of the bank holding that envelope like it was evidence in a crime scene. Because it was. My husband was standing near the revolving door. He'd followed me. He must have seen me leave the house and gotten suspicious. Or maybe he had a tracker on my phone. I didn't know anymore. He looked at the envelope in my hands. He said, "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I walked past him toward the parking lot. He followed me. He said my name twice, louder each time. I unlocked my car. I got in. I locked the doors. He knocked on the window. He said we needed to talk. He said I was overreacting. He said if I'd just listen for 5 minutes, he could explain everything. I started the engine. I drove out of the parking lot. I saw him standing there in my rearview mirror, hands in his pockets, looking confused and angry, and something else I couldn't name. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I went inside, and I locked myself in the bathroom, and I cried for the first time since July. I cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat hurt. And then I washed my face, pulled my hair back, and opened the envelope. I read every page 3 times. I made notes in the margins. I highlighted the dates. I cross-referenced the transfers with my calendar and realized most of them happened on nights when I was babysitting the grandkids or at book club or volunteering at the food pantry. He'd waited until I was out of the house. He'd planned it. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't panic. This was strategy. And I had 8 days until the closing. 8 days to stop him from stealing $90,000 of equity from the house I'd helped pay for with 29 years of teaching second graders how to read. 8 days to figure out why my daughter had iced me out right when this all started. 8 days to decide if I was going to protect my dignity or protect my marriage. I couldn't do both. That's what I didn't understand yet. I still thought there might be a way to fix this with a conversation. I still thought if I could just sit him down and show him the papers and say this isn't okay, this is fraud, you could go to jail, then maybe he'd stop. Maybe he'd apologize for real this time. Maybe he'd admit he was scared about money or retirement or getting old, and we'd figure it out together like we were supposed to. I still thought love could solve this. I was wrong. My husband came home 2 hours later. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me. He walked in and saw it and stopped. His face did something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, something colder. He sat down across from me. He folded his hands on the table like we were about to negotiate a business deal. He said, "You shouldn't have gone to the bank." I said, "You forged my signature." He said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "When? After you'd already taken the money?" He leaned back in his chair. He looked at me the way you'd look at a child having a tantrum. He said, "You don't understand how money works." He said, "We need liquidity." He said, "The rental property isn't generating enough income, and the housing market is strong right now, so it made sense to pull equity while we could." He said, "I was protecting us." I slid the papers across the table. I pointed to the transfers. I said, "Where did this money go?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the pages. He looked at his hands. He said, "I made some investments." I said, "What kind of investments?" He said, "That's not your concern." I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. I said, "It's my house. It's my signature. It's fraud." He stood up too. He was taller than me and he knew it. He said, "You're being dramatic." He said, "Nobody's committing fraud." He said, "We're married. It's joint property. I have every right to make financial decisions without running them by you like you're my parole officer." I said, "You don't have the right to forge my name." He said, "Prove it." And that's when I knew. He thought I wouldn't fight. He thought I'd back down because I always backed down. 32 years of backing down, 32 years of keeping the peace, 32 years of swallowing my anger so the kids wouldn't see us fight, so the neighbors wouldn't gossip, so I could pretend we were fine. He thought I'd do it again. He thought I'd let this go because I didn't have the spine to burn everything down. He was almost right. I almost walked away. I almost said, "Okay, fine, we'll talk about this later when we're both calm." But then my phone buzzed, a text from my daughter. "Mom, I think it's best if you don't come to the kids' Christmas program this year. We'll send you pictures." I stood there holding my phone, reading that message 3 times, and something inside me snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, clean break like a bone that's been cracked for months and finally gives. I looked at my husband. I said, "Did you tell her I was crazy?" He didn't answer. I said, "Did you tell her I was paranoid? Unstable? A bad influence on the kids?" His jaw tightened. He said, "I told her the truth. I told her you've been acting erratic since the summer, and I'm worried about you." I said, "Erratic?" He said, checking my phone, interrogating me, accusing me of things I didn't do. He said, "She's concerned, and frankly, so am I." He said, "Maybe you should talk to someone, a doctor, get your hormones checked or something." And there it was, the play. Discredit me, make me look unstable, isolate me from my daughter and grandkids, so when the money disappeared and I tried to fight back, nobody would believe me. They'd think I was a hysterical old woman having a breakdown. They'd think I was the problem. I put my phone down on the table. I picked up the envelope. I said, "I'm going to a lawyer." He said, "With what money?" "Our accounts are joint. I'll know the second you spend a dime." I said, "I have money you don't know about." That wasn't true, but I said it anyway because I needed him to doubt himself for once. I walked out of the kitchen. I went upstairs. I packed a bag with 3 days of clothes, my medications, my laptop, and the envelope. I heard him following me. He stood in the bedroom doorway. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Somewhere you can't find me." He laughed, actually laughed. He said, "You're not leaving. You're 63 years old. Where are you going to go? Who's going to take you in? Your daughter thinks you're losing it. Your son lives across the country. You don't have any money. You don't have anywhere to go." I zipped the bag. I picked it up. I walked past him toward the stairs. He grabbed my arm, not hard, just enough to stop me. He said, "Don't make this worse than it has to be." I pulled my arm away. I looked him in the eyes. I said, "I'm not the one who made this worse. You did that all by yourself." And I left. I got in my car and I drove. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have anywhere to go. But I drove anyway, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The bank manager had given me the name of a lawyer. I called the office from a gas station off the highway and left a voicemail explaining I needed help with a financial fraud case and a possible divorce. I said I could come in as soon as they had an opening. I didn't know if they'd call back. I didn't know if I could afford them. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I couldn't go back to that house. I checked into a budget motel near the county courthouse, the kind of place with floral bedspreads and a coffee maker that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since 1995. I paid cash for 2 nights. I sat on the edge of the bed and I called my son in California. He didn't answer. I left a message. I said, "I need you to call me back. It's about your father." I didn't say anything else. I didn't want to put it all in a voicemail. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted him to tell me I wasn't crazy. I wanted someone on my side. He called back an hour later. I told him everything. The kiss, the forgiveness, the separate account, the forged mortgage application, the closing in 6 days, the way his sister had cut me off, the way his father had tried to gaslight me into thinking I was unstable. My son was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, are you sure?" I felt something cold slide down my spine. I said, "Am I sure about what?" He said, "Are you sure he forged your signature? Are you sure you didn't sign something and forget? Are you sure you're not just upset about the kiss and seeing things that aren't there?" I couldn't speak. My own son, my own child, doubting me. He said, "I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm just saying, you've been under a lot of stress, and sometimes when we're emotional, we misinterpret things." He said, "Maybe you should just talk to Dad and figure this out before you do something you can't take back." I hung up. I sat on the bed in that motel room with the phone in my lap and I stared at the wall. The air conditioning hummed. A car door slammed outside. I could hear a couple arguing in the room next door, their voices muffled but sharp, and I realized I was completely alone. My husband had poisoned my daughter against me. My son thought I was overreacting. I didn't have friends close enough to crash on their couch. I didn't have siblings. My parents were dead. I had a small teacher's pension, a retirement account I couldn't touch without penalties, and maybe $800 in a checking account my husband didn't monitor because it was the account I used for personal expenses like haircuts and book club dues. $800. That's what 32 years of marriage had left me with. $800 and a motel room and a manila envelope full of evidence that my own children didn't believe. But I had something else. I had a lawyer's name. And I had 6 days until that closing. 6 days to stop him. 6 days to prove I wasn't crazy. 6 days to choose myself. I didn't know then that this story wasn't going to end with me fighting for scraps of my old life. I didn't know I was about to walk into a courtroom and meet someone who'd change everything. Someone who'd see exactly what my husband was doing and offer me a way out I never imagined. Someone who'd make my husband's betrayal look like the best thing that ever happened to me. But first, I had to survive the next 6 days. The lawyer called me back at 7:30 the next morning. Her name was Victoria Chen. She sounded young on the phone, maybe 40, with a voice that was polite but efficient in a way that made me trust her immediately. She said she had an opening at 10 if I could make it to her office in downtown Richmond. I said I'd be there. I showered in the motel bathroom where the water pressure was terrible and the towels were thin as paper. I put on the same black pants and blue sweater I'd worn yesterday because I hadn't packed much. I tried to do my makeup, but my hands were shaking and I gave up halfway through. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked exactly like what my husband wanted people to see, a woman falling apart. I drove to the address Victoria had given me. Her office was on the 4th floor of a renovated building near the courthouse, the kind of place with exposed brick and modern furniture that tried to look casual but wasn't. The receptionist offered me coffee. I said yes, even though I'd already had 2 cups at the motel and my stomach was churning. Victoria came out to meet me 5 minutes later. She was petite, maybe 5'2", wearing a gray suit and black heels, with her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She shook my hand firmly and led me into her office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the street below. I sat in a leather chair that was too deep and made me feel small. Victoria sat across from me with a legal pad and asked me to start from the beginning. I told her everything. The kiss, the forgiveness, the secret account, the forged signature, the closing in 5 days, my daughter cutting me off, my son not believing me. I handed her the manila envelope from the bank. She read every page carefully, making notes, asking questions. How long had we been married? Did we have a prenuptial agreement? Were both our names on the house deed? What was my husband's income? What was mine? Did I have any separate property? Did I have access to legal representation funds? Did I feel safe? That last question caught me off guard. I said, "Safe from what?" She said, "Your husband has isolated you from your children, forged legal documents, and accused you of being mentally unstable. Those are classic signs of financial and emotional abuse. I need to know if you feel physically safe." I thought about it. I said, "He's never hit me." She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I don't know. I don't think he'd hurt me, but I don't know who he is anymore." Victoria nodded. She put down her pen. She said, "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to file an emergency motion to stop the closing. We're going to file a fraud report with the police. We're going to freeze all joint accounts so he can't move any more money. We're going to petition for temporary financial orders so you have access to funds for living expenses and legal fees. and we're going to file for legal separation with the intent to divorce. She said it like she was reading a grocery list, calm and certain and completely in control. I said, "How much is this going to cost?" She said, "I'm not going to lie to you, it's expensive. My retainer is $5,000. But I work with clients on payment plans, and once we get temporary orders in place, your husband will be required to contribute to your legal fees since he earns more than you." I said, "I don't have $5,000. I have $800 in a checking account and maybe $12,000 in a retirement account I can't touch without penalties." Victoria leaned back in her chair. She studied me for a moment. Then she said, "Let me make some calls." She left the office. I sat there alone, looking out the window at the gray December sky, thinking about how I'd gotten here. 32 years, 3 decades, my entire adult life, gone. 20 minutes later, Victoria came back. She sat down and opened her laptop. She said, "I called a colleague who runs a nonprofit that provides legal aid for financial abuse victims. They're going to cover your retainer and court costs. You won't owe anything up front." I almost cried. I said, "Why would you do that for me?" She said, "Because I've seen this case 100 times. Men who think their wives are too old or too tired or too scared to fight back. Men who use their kids as weapons. Men who smile in public and commit fraud in private. And I'm tired of watching them get away with it." She said, "So let's not let him." We spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork. I signed authorizations. I signed affidavits. I provided account numbers and social security numbers and copies of every document I had. Victoria's assistant made copies and filed them electronically. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, we'd filed an emergency motion to stop the closing, a police report for fraud, and a petition for legal separation. Victoria said the court hearing for the emergency motion was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. She said I needed to be there. She said my husband would be there too because he'd be served with papers tonight. She said, "Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" I said, "A motel." She wrote down an address on a slip of paper. She said, "This is a short-term housing program for women going through financial crisis. It's clean, it's safe, and it's free for up to 30 days while you get on your feet. Call them. Tell them I sent you." I took the paper. I folded it carefully and put it in my purse. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when this is over." I left her office and sat in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I started the engine. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but something close. Possibility. The idea that I might survive this, that I might even win. I drove to the address Victoria had given me. It was a small building near a church, brick with white trim, clean and quiet. A woman in her 50s answered the door and introduced herself as Marie. She showed me to a room on the 2nd floor. It was small but bright, with a twin bed, a desk, a lamp, and a window overlooking a garden. There was a shared bathroom down the hall and a communal kitchen on the 1st floor. Marie said I could stay as long as I needed. She said there were support groups on Wednesday nights and legal clinics on Saturdays. She said I wasn't alone. I unpacked my bag. I sat on the bed. I called my daughter. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. I said, "I know you think I'm losing it, but I need you to listen. Your father forged my signature on a mortgage application. He's been hiding money for 2 years. I filed a police report today. There's a court hearing tomorrow morning. I'm not crazy. I'm not unstable. I'm protecting myself. If you don't believe me, ask your father to show you the bank statements. Ask him to explain why he opened an account without telling me. Ask him why he lied." I hung up. I didn't know if she'd listen. I didn't know if she'd call me back, but I'd said it. I'd put it out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the twin bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. I thought about my grandchildren. I thought about my daughter's cold politeness. I thought about my husband standing in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, watching me drive away. I thought about the closing that was supposed to happen in 4 days, and I thought about Victoria's question, "Do you feel safe?" I still didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. The hearing was at 9 the next morning. I wore the same black pants and a white blouse I'd packed. I met Victoria in the courthouse lobby. She handed me a folder with copies of all the motions we'd filed. She said, "Your husband's attorney is going to paint you as vindictive and irrational. They're going to say you're angry about an alleged affair and you're using the legal system to punish him. Don't react. Don't argue. Let me handle it. We walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh. My husband was already there with his lawyer, a man in his 60s wearing an expensive suit. My husband looked at me. I looked at him. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like I was a child who'd embarrassed him in public. The judge was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She reviewed the motions quickly, then looked up. She said, "This is an emergency hearing regarding an allegation of forged documents and unauthorized financial transactions. Let's hear from the petitioner first." Victoria stood. She laid out the case clearly and calmly. The secret account, the transfers, the forged mortgage application. The timeline that showed my husband had been planning this for months. She presented the bank statements. She presented the signature comparison. She presented the mortgage broker's testimony that my husband had claimed I was aware of the application and had verbally consented even though I'd never spoken to the broker. She said, "Mrs. Patterson has been financially and emotionally abused by her husband, who has used their shared assets to fund undisclosed investments while simultaneously isolating her from their adult children and undermining her credibility. She is here today asking the court to stop a fraudulent closing, freeze all joint assets, and grant her access to funds for living expenses while this matter is investigated." The judge looked at my husband's attorney. She said, "Response?" He stood. He smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. He said, "Your Honor, this is a domestic dispute being weaponized through the legal system. Mrs. Patterson is upset because her husband briefly connected with another woman at a social gathering. She has been monitoring his activities, accusing him of infidelity, and creating a hostile environment at home. The mortgage application in question is for a standard home equity line of credit, a common financial tool for married couples. Mr. Patterson believed he had his wife's consent based on prior conversations about their financial needs. This is not fraud. This is a miscommunication between spouses who are going through a rough patch. He suggested counseling. He suggested mediation. He suggested dismissing the emergency motion and allowing us to work this out privately." Victoria stood again. She said, "Your Honor, the signature on the mortgage application has been analyzed by a handwriting expert and does not match Mrs. Patterson's signature. The bank statements show 2 years of undisclosed transfers. This is not a miscommunication. This is fraud." The judge looked at the documents. She looked at my husband. She said, "Mr. Patterson, did you open a separate bank account without your wife's knowledge?" His attorney whispered something to him. My husband leaned toward the microphone. He said, "I opened an account to manage the rental income more efficiently. It was a business decision." The judge said, "Is your wife's name on that account?" He hesitated. He said, "No." The judge said, "Did you discuss this with her?" He said, "I didn't think I needed to." The judge took off her glasses. She said, "You didn't think you needed to discuss opening a secret account and transferring tens of thousands of dollars without your wife's knowledge or consent. Mr. Patterson, that is the definition of financial abuse." She granted the emergency motion. She stopped the closing. She froze all joint accounts pending a full investigation. She ordered temporary financial support so I'd have access to funds for living expenses and legal fees. And she scheduled a follow-up hearing in 2 weeks to address the fraud allegations and the separation petition. I sat there in the courtroom and I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just felt my heart slow down for the first time in days. Victoria touched my arm. She said, "You did good." As we walked out, my husband and his attorney were standing in the hallway. My husband looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not anger, not regret, something colder. He said, "You're going to regret this." Victoria stepped between us. She said, "Mr. Patterson, I suggest you direct all communication through your attorney." We walked away, but I heard his voice behind me, quiet and sharp. "You'll never see those kids again." I stopped walking. Victoria said, "Keep moving. Don't give him the reaction he wants." I kept moving, but his words followed me out of the courthouse, down the steps, into the parking lot. "You'll never see those kids again." And I realized that's what this was really about. Not the money, not the house, the control. He'd been losing control over me, so he took control of the thing I loved most, my grandchildren, my daughter, my family. He made me the villain so he could be the victim, and it was working. I got into my car. I gripped the steering wheel. I let myself cry. Not for long, just enough to let the pressure out. Then I wiped my face, started the engine, and drove back to the housing program. I had 2 weeks until the next hearing, 2 weeks to gather more evidence, 2 weeks to figure out how to get my daughter to listen, 2 weeks to survive. But I'd won today. I'd stopped the closing. I'd proven the fraud. I'd stood up in court and fought back, and I wasn't done, not even close. What I didn't know was that the fight had just started. 2 days after the hearing, my daughter finally called me back. I was sitting in the communal kitchen at the housing program, drinking coffee and half watching the morning news on the small television mounted above the counter. My phone rang. I saw her name. My hands went cold. I answered. I said, "Hello?" She said, "Mom, we need to talk." Her voice was tight, careful. I said, "Okay." She said, "I talked to Dad. He told me what happened in court. He said you filed fraud charges against him. He said you're trying to take everything and leave him with nothing. He's devastated, Mom. He said he thought you were a team." I closed my eyes. I said, "Did he tell you about the bank account he opened without my knowledge? Did he tell you about the 2 years of rental income he's been hiding? Did he tell you about the forged signature on a mortgage application?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He said there was a miscommunication. He said he thought you knew about the account. He said you've been acting paranoid since the summer, and he's worried about you." I said, "I'm not paranoid. I filed a police report. A judge reviewed the evidence and granted an emergency motion to stop the closing because the signature on the mortgage application doesn't match mine. That's not paranoia. That's fraud." She said, "Mom, I don't want to get in the middle of this. This is between you and Dad." I said, "You're already in the middle. You stopped letting me see the kids. You stopped answering my calls. You iced me out right when your father started stealing from me." "That's not a coincidence." She raised her voice. She said, "Nobody's stealing from you. You're being dramatic. You're tearing this family apart because you can't get over a stupid kiss that happened 6 months ago." I felt something sharp in my chest. I said, "This isn't about the kiss. This is about your father committing fraud and using you and the kids to control me." She said, "I can't do this right now." She hung up. I sat there holding the phone. Marie walked into the kitchen and saw my face. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. She said, "Bad call?" I nodded. She said, "Let me guess. Your kid thinks you're the problem." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because that's how abusers work. They turn your kids against you. They make you the villain so nobody believes you when you try to get help." She sipped her coffee. She said, "My ex-husband did the same thing. Told my son I was unstable. Told him I was making things up. My son didn't talk to me for 2 years." She said, "But eventually, the truth comes out. It always does. You just have to stay alive long enough to see it." I said, "What if she never believes me?" Marie shrugged. She said, "Then you grieve that loss and you build a life anyway. You can't control her. You can only control yourself." That week, I focused on gathering evidence. Victoria had given me a checklist. I needed copies of every bank statement, every tax return, every financial document related to our marriage and the rental property. I went to the county records office and requested copies of the deed, the mortgage history, and the property tax payments. I went to our accountant and requested copies of our joint tax returns for the last 10 years. I created a spreadsheet tracking every transfer from the joint account to the secret account, cross-referencing dates with my calendar to show that most of the transfers happened when I was out of the house. I documented everything. It was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Every piece of paper, every transaction, every lie in black and white made the picture clearer. My husband hadn't made a mistake. He'd executed a plan. And the plan had a goal: remove me from the financial equation while keeping me compliant by threatening access to my grandchildren. On Friday, 5 days before the next hearing, I got a letter in the mail at the housing program. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of an email. The email was from my husband to my daughter, sent 3 weeks before the court hearing. It said, "Mom's not doing well. I think she's having some kind of breakdown. She's been accusing me of things that aren't true, checking my phone, following me around. I'm worried about her mental state. I don't think it's safe for her to be around the kids right now until she gets help. Can you keep some distance for a while? Just until we figure this out." I held the paper with both hands. I read it 3 times. This was it. This was the proof that he'd deliberately poisoned my daughter against me. This was the smoking gun. But I had no idea who sent it. There was no note, no explanation, just the email. I called Victoria. I told her about the letter. She said, "Bring it to my office immediately. Do not touch it with your bare hands. Put it in a plastic bag." I did. I drove to her office. She put on gloves and examined the paper under a lamp. She said, "This is evidence of parental alienation. If we can prove your husband sent this with the intent to isolate you from your daughter and grandchildren as part of a pattern of financial abuse, it strengthens your case significantly." She said, "But we need to know who sent this to you. Do you have any idea?" I said, "None." She said, "Think. Who has access to your husband's email? Who would want to help you?" I thought about it. I said, "Maybe someone at his office. Someone who saw what he was doing and felt guilty." Victoria said, "Or maybe your daughter forwarded it to you. Maybe she read it and started having doubts." I said, "She hung up on me 3 days ago. She thinks I'm the problem." Victoria said, "People change their minds when they see evidence. Let me reach out to her attorney and see if she's willing to talk." That weekend, I got a text from my son in California. It said, "Mom, I'm sorry I doubted you. I talked to a lawyer friend out here, and he said what Dad did is textbook fraud. I should have believed you. I'm flying out next week. I'll be there for the hearing." I sat on the edge of my bed and cried. Not sad tears. Relief. My son believed me. I wasn't alone anymore. The days before the second hearing blurred together. I barely slept. I rehearsed what I'd say if the judge asked me questions. I practiced staying calm, keeping my voice steady, not crying. Victoria prepped me for cross-examination. She said, "Your husband's attorney is going to try to rattle you. He's going to bring up the kiss. He's going to suggest you're vengeful and irrational. Don't take the bait. Just tell the truth." The morning of the hearing, I woke up at 5. I showered. I put on a navy dress I'd bought at a thrift store near the housing program. I did my makeup carefully. I wanted to look calm, competent, sane. My son met me in the courthouse lobby. He hugged me tight. He said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." We walked into the courtroom together. My husband was already there. He looked thinner, tired. When he saw my son sitting next to me, his face went pale. The judge called the hearing to order. Victoria presented the new evidence. The email, the financial records, the pattern of isolation. She called me to the stand. I swore to tell the truth. Victoria asked me to explain, in my own words, what had happened over the last 6 months. I told the story, the kiss, the forgiveness, the discovery, the secret account, the forged signature, the way my husband had turned my daughter against me, the email. I kept my voice steady. I didn't cry. I looked at the judge, not at my husband. When I finished, Victoria said, "No further questions." My husband's attorney stood. He said, "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you've been obsessed with your husband's alleged infidelity since July?" I said, "I wasn't obsessed. I was hurt." He said, "Isn't it true that you checked his phone without his permission?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Isn't it true that you accused him of things he didn't do?" I said, "No. I accused him of things he did do." He paused. He said, "You're 63 years old, Mrs. Patterson. Don't you think it's possible you misunderstood some of these financial transactions?" Victoria objected. The judge sustained it. The attorney tried a different angle. He said, "You filed for legal separation because you're angry about a kiss, not because of any real financial abuse. You're using the courts to punish your husband for a momentary lapse in judgment." I looked at him. I said, "I filed for legal separation because my husband forged my signature, hid money from me for 2 years, and turned my daughter against me so I'd be too isolated to fight back. That's not punishment. That's survival." The courtroom went quiet. The judge looked at me. She looked at my husband. She looked at the stack of evidence on her desk. She said, "I've reviewed the financial records. I've reviewed the handwriting analysis. I've reviewed the email submitted as evidence." She said, "Mr. Patterson, you have engaged in a pattern of financial abuse, fraud, and parental alienation. This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with a full hearing on the divorce and asset division. In the meantime, I am granting Mrs. Patterson exclusive use of the marital home, ongoing financial support, and a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting her directly or through third parties." She said, You will communicate only through your attorneys. Any violation of this order will result in contempt charges." She banged the gavel. It was over. Victoria squeezed my hand. My son put his arm around me. We walked out of the courtroom. My husband stood in the hallway, his attorney murmuring something to him. He looked at me. For the first time, he looked scared. That afternoon, I moved back into my house. It felt strange walking through the front door, knowing he wasn't there, knowing he couldn't come back without violating the restraining order. I walked through the rooms slowly. I opened windows. I threw out his shaving cream and his cologne and the coffee mug he used every morning. I stripped the sheets off our bed and put them in the trash. I slept in the guest room that night. And for the first time in months, I slept through until morning. But the story wasn't over, because 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice said, "Mrs. Patterson?" I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is David Langford. I'm the CEO of Langford Holdings. I believe you know my sister, Victoria Chen." I said, "Victoria's your sister?" He said, "She told me about your case. She said you'd been married for 32 years to a man who committed fraud and tried to steal your financial independence." He said, "I'm calling because I'd like to offer you a job." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, not sure I'd heard him correctly. I said, "I'm sorry, what?" David Langford said, "A job. I'm looking for someone to help manage a charitable foundation my company runs. It's focused on financial literacy and economic empowerment for women over 50. Victoria mentioned you were a teacher for nearly 30 years. I think your experience would be valuable." I sat down at the kitchen table. I said, "Mr. Langford, I appreciate the call, but I'm 63 years old. I just got out of a terrible marriage. I'm in the middle of a divorce. I don't have any experience with foundations or business or anything like that." He said, "You have experience surviving. You have experience standing up for yourself when everyone told you to sit down. That's exactly what this foundation needs. Someone real, someone who's lived it." I said, "I don't understand why you're calling me." He said, "Because my sister told me you're the kind of person who fights, and I respect that." He said, "The position is full-time, based here in Richmond, $65,000 a year with benefits. You'd work with a team to develop programs, review grant applications, and speak at events. No pressure. If you're interested, I'd like to meet for coffee and talk more. If not, I understand." I said, "When?" He said, "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. There's a coffee shop on Broad Street called Morningside. Do you know it?" I said, "I'll find it." He said, "Good. See you then." He hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. Victoria's brother, a CEO, a job offer. It felt surreal. It felt like a setup or a pity offer or something that wouldn't actually happen once he met me in person. But I didn't have anything to lose. So the next morning, I drove to Morningside Coffee. It was a small place with brick walls, local art on the walls, and the smell of fresh espresso. I arrived 10 minutes early. I ordered a coffee and sat at a table near the window. At exactly 10 o'clock, a man walked in. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with graying hair and sharp blue eyes, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked around, saw me, and walked over. He said, "Mrs. Patterson?" I stood. I said, "Yes, call me Ellen." He shook my hand. He said, "David." He ordered a coffee and sat down across from me. He said, "Thank you for meeting me. I know this seems out of nowhere, but Victoria told me about your case last week. She doesn't usually talk about her clients, but something about your situation made her angry in a way I haven't seen in years. She said you were a teacher who spent 3 decades helping kids learn to read, and your husband repaid you by trying to steal your financial security and turn your own children against you. She said you walked into court alone and fought back anyway." David leaned forward. He said, "My mother went through something similar when I was in college. My father emptied their accounts and disappeared, left her with nothing. She was 56 years old and had never worked outside the home. She didn't know how to balance a checkbook. She didn't know what a credit score was. She spent 2 years living in a 1-bedroom apartment, working as a cashier, trying to rebuild." He said, "She died of a heart attack 5 years later. I've always believed the stress killed her. That's why I started this foundation. Because women like my mother, women like you, shouldn't have to lose everything because a man decided he deserved more." I didn't know what to say. I looked down at my coffee. I said, "I'm sorry about your mother." He said, "Me too." He said, "So here's what I'm proposing. Come work for the foundation. Help us create programs that actually help women in your situation, not just legal aid, but financial literacy, job training, housing assistance, emotional support, real resources. You'd be the public face of it. You'd tell your story. You'd connect with other women going through the same thing. He said, I know it's a lot. I know you're still in the middle of your divorce, but I think you could do a lot of good, and I think it would be good for you too. I looked at him. I said, why do I feel like there's a catch? He smiled. He said, no catch, just hard work, and the chance to turn the worst thing that ever happened to you into something that helps other people. I thought about it. I thought about the women at the housing program, sitting in the kitchen late at night, crying over their phones, trying to figure out how to survive. I thought about Marie telling me the truth always comes out. I thought about my daughter hanging up on me. I thought about my husband standing in the bank lobby, thinking I'd never fight back. I said, when do I start? David said, Monday. I started that Monday. The foundation office was in a renovated warehouse in downtown Richmond, open and bright with floor-to-ceiling windows and desks arranged in clusters. There were 12 people on staff, mostly women, ranging in age from late 20s to mid-60s. David introduced me to everyone. He showed me to my desk near a window overlooking the street. He gave me a laptop and a phone and a stack of files with grant applications and program proposals. He said, read through these, get a feel for what we're doing. We'll meet this afternoon and I'll answer any questions. I spent the morning reading applications from women who needed help with legal fees, women who needed emergency housing, women who needed job training after 20 years as stay-at-home mothers, women whose husbands had stolen their savings, forged their signatures, turned their children against them. Every file read like a version of my own story, different details, same structure, isolation, manipulation, theft, control. By lunchtime, I felt sick. David knocked on the edge of my desk. He said, want to grab lunch? There's a deli down the block. We walked to the deli. We ordered sandwiches and sat at a small table by the window. He said, overwhelming, isn't it? I said, I had no idea how common this was. He said, most people don't. Financial abuse is invisible until it happens to you. Then you realize it's everywhere. We talked about the foundation's goals. We talked about my role. He wanted me to review applications, help design workshops, and eventually speak at fundraising events. He said, I know public speaking might feel intimidating, but you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. People respond to honesty. I said, I've never done anything like this. He said, you stood up in court and told your story in front of a judge and your husband and his lawyer. You've already done the hardest part. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into the work. I reviewed applications, I called women on the phone and listened to their stories. I helped design a financial literacy workshop for women over 50. I wrote blog posts for the foundation's website about warning signs of financial abuse and how to protect yourself. I felt useful. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a purpose beyond survival. But my personal life was still a mess. My daughter still wasn't speaking to me. My son had flown back to California after the hearing, but called me every few days to check in. The divorce was moving forward slowly, tied up in depositions and document requests and legal maneuvering. My husband's attorney was fighting everything, claiming I was exaggerating the abuse and demanding half of everything, including my teacher's pension. Victoria said, he's trying to exhaust you. He thinks if he drags this out long enough, you'll settle for less just to make it end. Don't give in. I said, I won't. But some nights, lying in the guest room of the house that no longer felt like mine, I wondered if it was worth it. If I should just take whatever settlement he offered and disappear. Start over somewhere new where nobody knew me. Then I'd think about the women calling the foundation, their voices shaking, asking if it was too late to fight back. And I'd remember, it's never too late. 4 weeks after I started at the foundation, David asked me to have dinner with him. He said, not work-related, just dinner, if you're comfortable with that. I hesitated. I said, I'm still married, technically. He said, I know. I'm not asking for anything complicated. Just dinner with someone who understands what you're going through. I said yes. We went to a small Italian restaurant near the river. We sat at a table in the corner. We talked about everything except work. He told me about growing up in Richmond, about his father leaving, about his mother working 3 jobs to keep the lights on. He told me about building his company from nothing, about the mistakes he'd made, about the things he wished he'd done differently. I told him about teaching second grade, about the kids who couldn't sit still, about the parents who showed up to conferences exhausted and scared. I told him about my daughter's wedding, about holding my first grandchild, about the moment I realized I'd forgiven my husband for something I should never have forgiven. David listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He just listened. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car. He said, "Thank you for trusting me." I said, "Thank you for the job, for believing me." He said, "I didn't give you the job because I felt sorry for you. I gave you the job because you're good at it." I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not love, not even attraction exactly. Just the quiet warmth of being seen by someone who didn't need anything from me. But that warmth didn't last, because the next morning I got a call from Victoria. She said, "We have a problem. Your husband's attorney just filed a motion claiming you've been cohabiting with another man and using foundation resources for personal gain. They're alleging fraud and asking the court to revoke the temporary financial orders." I said, "What? I haven't been cohabiting with anyone." Victoria said, "They have photos of you having dinner with David Langford. They're claiming you've been in a romantic relationship with him since before the separation, and that he gave you a job as a way to funnel money to you outside the court's oversight." I felt my stomach drop. I said, "That's insane. I've known David for 4 weeks. The dinner was our first time seeing each other outside of work." Victoria said, "I know, but they're going to use it to paint you as a liar and a manipulator. We have a hearing in 3 days. We need to be ready." I hung up. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen. I thought about my husband hiring someone to follow me, to photograph me, to build a case that I was the cheater, the liar, the one who destroyed our marriage. I thought about how far he was willing to go to win, how much he was willing to spend to make me lose, and I thought, I'm not giving him the satisfaction. I called David. I told him what happened. He said, "I'm sorry. This is my fault. I shouldn't have asked you to dinner." I said, "You didn't do anything wrong." He said, "I'll testify at the hearing. I'll make it clear there's nothing inappropriate happening. I'll show the court the foundation's financials and prove you earned that job." I said, "This is going to be humiliating." He said, "Probably. But you've survived worse." The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. I spent 3 days preparing with Victoria. We rehearsed my testimony. We gathered evidence. Emails showing the job offer came from Victoria first. Payroll records showing I was paid the same as other employees. My work product proving I'd earned my salary. We prepared David to testify about the foundation's hiring practices and his relationship with me, which was professional and nothing more. I barely slept the night before. I kept thinking about sitting in that courtroom while my husband's attorney showed photos of me laughing at dinner with another man. I kept thinking about how it would look, how easy it would be to believe I was lying, how maybe I deserved this. But then I remembered something Marie had said at the housing program. You can't control what people believe. You can only control the truth you tell. Friday morning, I walked into the courthouse. My son had flown back from California to be there. David met us in the lobby, wearing a suit, looking nervous. Victoria handed me a folder. She said, "Remember, tell the truth. Don't apologize for having dinner with a friend. Don't apologize for working. Don't apologize for surviving." The hearing started at 9. My husband's attorney presented the photos. Me and David at the restaurant. Me and David walking to my car. Me laughing. He said, "Mrs. Patterson claims to be a victim of financial abuse. Yet within weeks of separating from her husband, she secured a lucrative position at a foundation run by a wealthy CEO with whom she is clearly romantically involved. This calls into question everything she's claimed about her husband and her financial situation." Victoria stood. She said, "Mr. Langford is here to testify. I suggest we let him explain the circumstances of Mrs. Patterson's employment before we draw conclusions based on 2 people having dinner." The judge nodded. David took the stand. He explained the foundation's mission. He explained how Victoria had told him about my case. He explained the job offer. He explained that he'd asked me to dinner because he respected my work and wanted to get to know me as a person, not because we were in a relationship. He said, "I've been divorced for 8 years. I'm not looking for anything complicated. I asked Ellen to dinner because she's intelligent and kind, and I enjoyed her company. That's it." My husband's attorney said, "Mr. Langford, isn't it true that your company has assets exceeding $500 million? David said, "Yes." The attorney said, And isn't it true that you could easily provide Mrs. Patterson with financial support far beyond what her husband ever could? David said, I could, but I haven't. She earns her salary. She pays her own bills. She's not dependent on me for anything. The attorney smirked. He said, Yet. David looked at him. He said, Mrs. Patterson doesn't need me. She doesn't need anyone. She's one of the strongest people I've ever met. And if you're trying to suggest she's manipulating me or using me, you're wrong. She's doing the opposite. She's building a life on her own terms after spending 32 years with a man who tried to erase her. The courtroom went quiet. The judge looked at my husband. She looked at me. She said, I've heard enough. She said, the motion is denied. There is no evidence of cohabitation. There is no evidence of fraud. Mrs. Patterson is employed legally and is earning her salary through legitimate work. The temporary financial orders remain in place. She looked at my husband's attorney. She said, If you file another frivolous motion in this case, I will sanction you. Court adjourned. I walked out into the hallway. My son hugged me. Victoria said, That was close. David said, I meant what I said in there. I looked at him. I said, Thank you. He said, I have a question. I said, Okay. He said, When this is all over, when the divorce is final and you've had time to breathe, would you let me take you to dinner again? Not as your boss, just as someone who'd like to know you better. I felt something warm in my chest. I said, Ask me again when this is over. He smiled. He said, Deal. But the battle wasn't over. Because 3 days later, I got a text from my daughter. It said, Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over tomorrow? I wrote back, Yes. She arrived at noon. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd confronted my husband about the bank statements months ago. My daughter looked tired, older. She said, I read the email. I said, What email? She said, The one Dad sent me telling me you were unstable. Someone sent me a copy. Anonymous. She said, and I started thinking about the timeline, about when he asked me to keep the kids away from you, about when the bank stuff started, about how he kept saying you were paranoid but he could never explain why. She looked down at her coffee. She said, I talked to his attorney's office. I called pretending I needed to send Dad some documents. The receptionist let it slip that they've been working on his case for almost a year, since last February. A year before you even filed for separation. I felt my breath catch. I said, A year? She nodded. She said, He was planning this before you caught him with that woman. Before any of it. He was setting it up. The secret account, the rental income, the isolation. He was getting ready to leave you with nothing. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet. She said, I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have believed you. I should have listened. I said, You're listening now. She said, I kept the kids from you. I used them as a weapon because Dad convinced me you were the problem. I hurt you. I don't know how to fix that. I reached across the table. I took her hand. I said, You're here. That's how you fix it. We sat there for a long time, holding hands across the kitchen table, crying. Then she said, The kids ask about you every day. Can they come over this weekend? I said, Yes, please. That Saturday, my daughter brought all 3 grandchildren to my house. The oldest, Emma, ran through the front door and threw her arms around me. The middle one, Jack, asked if I still had the cookies I used to make. The youngest, Sophie, climbed into my lap and fell asleep. We spent the afternoon in the backyard. I pushed them on the swings. I helped them build a fort out of old blankets. I listened to them tell me everything I'd missed. School projects, lost teeth, birthday parties, nightmares, new friends. My daughter sat on the porch steps watching us. When the kids were playing on the other side of the yard, she said, I told Dad I'm testifying at the divorce hearing, against him. I looked at her. I said, You don't have to do that. She said, Yes, I do. He used me to hurt you. He lied to me. He made me complicit. I need to make this right. I said, It's going to be hard. He's going to be angry. She said, I know, but I'm done protecting him. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, I kept working at the foundation. I kept going to therapy. I kept rebuilding my life piece by piece. David and I had coffee once a week. Just coffee. Nothing more. We talked about work and books and our kids and the future. He never pushed. He never asked for more than I was ready to give. And slowly, I started to feel like myself again. Not the self I was before my marriage. A different self, stronger, clearer, less afraid. The night before the final hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m, drinking tea, looking at the papers Victoria had prepared. 32 years of marriage reduced to financial statements and asset division and custody arrangements for grandchildren. My phone buzzed, a text from David. It said, "You're going to do great tomorrow. You've already won. You just have to show up and let them see it." I wrote back, "Thank you." He wrote, "I'll be there, in the gallery, if you want." I wrote, "I want." The next morning, I walked into that courtroom for the last time. The courtroom felt different that morning, fuller. My son sat in the front row on my side. My daughter sat next to him. David sat 3 rows back, exactly where he said he'd be. Victoria was at the table next to me, her files organized in neat stacks, her pen ready. Across the aisle, my husband sat with his attorney. He looked smaller somehow, grayer. When he glanced at our daughter sitting on my side, his face crumpled for just a second before he looked away. The judge entered. We stood. She sat. She said, "This is the final hearing in the matter of Patterson versus Patterson. We're here to address asset division, spousal support, and related financial matters. Let's proceed." Victoria stood. She presented the evidence we'd been building for months. The timeline of the secret account, the forged signature on the mortgage application, the transfers that happened when I was out of the house, the email my husband had sent to our daughter to isolate me, the pattern of financial control and emotional abuse. Then she called my daughter to the stand. I watched her walk up to the witness box. She swore to tell the truth. She sat down. She looked at me once, quickly, then focused on Victoria. Victoria said, "Can you tell the court about your relationship with your mother before the separation?" My daughter said, "We were close. I saw her almost every week. She babysat my kids. We had dinner together. She was a good mom and a great grandmother." Victoria said, "When did that change?" My daughter said, "Last fall. My father called me and said my mom was acting unstable. He said she was paranoid, accusing him of things that weren't true, and he was worried about her mental health. He asked me to keep some distance until she got help. He said it wasn't safe for her to be around my kids." Victoria said, "Did you believe him?" My daughter said, "Yes. He's my father. I trusted him. I thought I was protecting my children." Victoria said, "When did you realize he was lying?" My daughter's voice cracked. She said, "When someone sent me a copy of the email he'd written, when I saw the dates, when I realized he'd been planning this for over a year, when I saw the bank statements showing he'd been hiding money from my mom for 2 years, when I understood he'd used me and my kids as weapons to control her." She wiped her eyes. She said, "He made me complicit in abusing my own mother, and I'll never forgive him for that." The courtroom was silent. My husband's attorney stood for cross-examination. He said, "Ms. Patterson, isn't it true that your parents' marriage had problems long before your father opened that account?" My daughter said, "Every marriage has problems. That doesn't give you the right to commit fraud." He said, "Isn't it true your mother has been dating David Langford, a wealthy man, since shortly after the separation?" My daughter said, "My mother had dinner with a man who treated her with respect. That's not a crime. That's called moving on." He tried another angle. He said, "You're testifying for your mother because you feel guilty, not because your father did anything wrong." My daughter looked at him. She said, "I'm testifying because my father lied to me, manipulated me, and tried to erase my mother financially and emotionally. And I'm done pretending that's okay just because he's my father." The attorney sat down. Victoria said, "No further questions." My daughter stepped down. She walked past my husband without looking at him. She sat down next to my son. He put his arm around her. Next, Victoria called the forensic accountant who'd analyzed our financial records. He testified that my husband had diverted over $97,000 from joint assets into the secret account over 2 years. He testified that the rental income should have been split equally, but had been hidden. He testified that the mortgage application bore a forged signature. Then Victoria called me. I walked to the stand. I swore to tell the truth. I sat down. Victoria asked me to describe my marriage. I said, "I thought we were partners. I thought we were building a life together. I worked for 29 years as a teacher. I contributed to our household income. I raised our children. I managed our home. I trusted him with our finances because he said he was better with numbers. I didn't know he was using that trust to steal from me." Victoria said, "What did you feel when you discovered the secret account?" I said, "Betrayed, terrified. I realized I didn't know the person I'd been married to for 32 years. I realized I'd spent my entire adult life with someone who saw me as an obstacle to remove, not a partner to cherish." Victoria said, "What do you want from this divorce?" I said, "I want what I earned. Half of our assets, half of the retirement accounts, half of the equity in the house and the rental property. I want my financial independence. I want to be able to support myself without fear. I want my husband to face consequences for fraud. And I want my grandchildren to know that their grandmother fought for herself when everyone told her to stay quiet." Victoria said, "No further questions." My husband's attorney stood. He said, "Mrs. Patterson, you've painted yourself as a victim, but isn't it true you've already moved on? You have a new job, a new relationship, a new life?" I said, "I have a job I earned. I have a friend who treats me with respect, and I have a life I'm building after my husband tried to destroy me. Those things aren't evidence that I wasn't abused. They're evidence that I survived." He said, "You're asking for half of everything, but you're already earning $65,000 a year. You don't need your husband's money." I said, "I don't need his money. I earned my share of our assets. There's a difference between need and entitlement. I'm entitled to half of what we built together." He sat down. I stepped down from the stand. I walked back to the table. Victoria squeezed my hand under the table. The judge called for closing arguments. Victoria stood. She said, "Your Honor, this case is about power and control. For 32 years, Mr. Patterson controlled the finances. He controlled the narrative. He controlled his wife's access to her own children and grandchildren. When she discovered his fraud and fought back, he tried to destroy her credibility by calling her unstable, vindictive, and opportunistic. But the evidence is clear. He committed fraud. He forged her signature. He hid nearly $100,000. He weaponized their daughter against her. And even now, he refuses to take responsibility. Mrs. Patterson is asking for what she's entitled to under the law: an equitable division of marital assets, spousal support during her transition to financial independence, and accountability for the abuse she endured. She's not asking for revenge. She's asking for justice." My husband's attorney argued that I was exaggerating, that the financial decisions were made jointly even if I didn't remember, that I'd moved on quickly with another man and therefore didn't deserve support. The judge listened. She took notes. When both sides finished, she said, "I'll take this under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." I walked out of the courthouse into the cold March air. My son and daughter walked on either side of me. David waited by the steps. He said, "You did it." I said, "We don't know the ruling yet." He said, "Doesn't matter. You stood up. You told the truth. You won the part that counts." 2 weeks later, the ruling came. Victoria called me at work. She said, "We won. Not just won. We won everything." The judge granted me half of all marital assets. She granted me half the equity in both properties. She granted me spousal support for 5 years to help me transition to full financial independence. She granted me half of my husband's retirement accounts. And she referred the fraud case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Victoria said, "The judge wrote in her ruling that your husband's conduct was egregious and that his attempts to discredit you in court only proved the extent of his need for control. She said you showed extraordinary courage." I sat at my desk, holding the phone, crying quietly. Victoria said, "Ellen, you did it. You got your life back." That weekend, I had all 3 grandchildren over for a sleepover. We made cookies. We watched movies. We built a blanket fort in the living room and told stories until they fell asleep in a pile on the floor. My daughter picked them up Sunday morning. She hugged me on the porch. She said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I said, "I could never give up on you." The next week, David asked me to dinner again. This time, I said yes without hesitation. We went to a small French restaurant downtown. We sat at a quiet table in the corner. We talked about everything and nothing. At the end of the night, he walked me to my car. He said, "I know this is complicated. I know you're still healing, but I need you to know something." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm not interested in rescuing you. You don't need rescuing. You've already saved yourself, but I'd like to be part of your life, if you'll let me." I looked at him. I said, "I'm 63 years old. I'm divorced. I have 2 grown children and 3 grandchildren and a job I'm still figuring out. I'm not easy. He said, I'm 56. I'm divorced. I have a company that takes up too much of my time and a past full of mistakes. I'm not easy either. He said, but I think we could be complicated together. I smiled. I said, okay. He said, okay? I said, okay. Let's try. He kissed me, right there in the parking lot under the streetlights, soft and gentle and real. Not like the kiss my husband gave that woman in our driveway, not stolen or guilty or small. This kiss felt like a beginning. 3 months later, David asked me to move in with him. I said no. I said I needed to live on my own for a while, to prove to myself I could. He said he understood. 6 months after that, he asked me again. This time I said yes. We didn't get married right away. We lived together for a year first. We learned each other's rhythms. We argued about stupid things like where to put the dishes and what temperature to keep the house. We figured out how to be 2 whole people sharing space, not 2 halves trying to complete each other. My ex-husband faced misdemeanor fraud charges. He pled guilty and paid a fine. He lost his job. He moved to a smaller town 2 hours away. My daughter spoke to him occasionally, but the relationship was strained. My son didn't speak to him at all. I felt sad about that sometimes. Not for my ex-husband, but for my kids, for the loss of the father they thought they had. But I also knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix. They had to grieve that loss in their own time. 18 months after the divorce was finalized, David proposed. We were sitting on the back porch of his house, our house, watching the sunset. He didn't get down on one knee. He just took my hand and said, I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? I said yes. We got married at a small courthouse ceremony with just my kids, my grandkids, Victoria, and a few close friends. I wore a simple blue dress. David wore a suit. My granddaughter Emma was the flower girl. The judge who married us was the same judge who'd presided over my divorce. She smiled at me before the ceremony and said, I'm glad to see you happy. We didn't have a honeymoon. We just went home and had dinner with the kids. It was perfect. The foundation grew. We helped hundreds of women get legal aid, job training, housing assistance, and emotional support. I spoke at events. I told my story over and over. Every time women came up to me afterward with tears in their eyes saying, that's my story. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing me I can fight too. I never forgot what it felt like to be 63 years old, standing in a bank lobby, holding evidence that my husband was trying to erase me. I never forgot what it felt like to be told I was crazy, unstable, paranoid. I never forgot what it felt like to lose access to my grandchildren because someone weaponized them against me. But I also never forgot what it felt like to stand up in court and tell the truth, to have my daughter sit on my side, to walk out of that courtroom knowing I'd won, to kiss someone who saw me as whole and valuable and strong. My ex-husband called me once, about 2 years after the divorce. He left a voicemail. He said, I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I understand what I did was wrong. I never called him back, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need his apology to move forward. I'd already moved forward without him. Some people asked me if I was angry that I'd wasted 32 years on a man who betrayed me. I said, I didn't waste them. I raised 2 beautiful children. I had moments of real happiness. I learned what I was capable of surviving. Those years made me who I am. I just wish I'd left sooner, but I didn't. And that's okay too. 5 years after my divorce, David and I were sitting in our living room on a Sunday afternoon. My daughter and her family were coming for dinner. My son was flying in from California for the week. The grandkids were getting bigger, louder, funnier. Emma was 12 now, Jack was 10, Sophie was 8. They called David Grandpa David, even though he wasn't their biological grandfather. He never corrected them. David looked at me and said, Do you ever regret it, fighting back the way you did? I thought about it. I said, no, not for a second. He said, even though it was hard? I said, especially because it was hard, because it taught me I was stronger than I thought. It taught my kids that you don't stay in situations that hurt you just because leaving is scary. It taught my grandkids that their grandmother doesn't back down. He smiled. He said, I'm glad you didn't back down, because otherwise I never would have met you. I said, you would have met me. I worked for your foundation. He said, you know what I mean. I leaned against him. I said, "Yeah, I know what you mean." The doorbell rang. The grandkids burst through the door with their noise and their energy and their sticky hands. My daughter hugged me. My son hugged me. We gathered around the table. We ate and laughed and argued about which movie to watch later. And I looked around at the life I'd built from the wreckage of my marriage, and I thought, this is what winning looks like. Not perfection, not revenge, just peace, just love, just the quiet knowledge that I chose myself when it mattered most, and I'd do it again. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. That helps us keep sharing stories of strong women, families, and the unexpected turns of life. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. See you in the next video.